The quiet erosion. Isabella stared at the paint samples against the wall of her home office, though none of them quite captured what she was reaching for. After 2 decades of marriage, she'd become expert at choosing the right colors for everyone else's spaces while her own life seemed to exist in muted grays. 20 years. 2,000 moments that had slipped like sand through her fingers, replaced by routines. Coffee at 6:15, dinner at 7, separate rooms by 10. Marcus was kind, stable, reliable. A good man. But somewhere between their wedding day and now, desire had been quietly suffocated by responsibility. The boutique hotel project arrived on her desk like an unexpected breath. "We want something that makes people feel again," the client said. Isabella understood immediately. She'd been going through the motions of feeling for so long that she'd forgotten what it meant to actually experience something. She met Julian on a Tuesday afternoon in the lobby she was redesigning. He was reviewing acoustics for the new piano installation, and when he spoke about music, his entire face transformed. His hands moved with the words, painting invisible landscapes in the air. He looked at her, really looked, when she answered his question about the design concept. No one looked at Isabella like that anymore. "You understand rhythm," he said, gesturing toward her sketches. "In design, you're creating a composition. Each element building toward something that makes people feel." "Most people don't think about it that way," Isabella replied, suddenly aware of how she looked, the gray streaking through her hair that she'd stopped bothering to color. "Most people don't think about music either until it's already moving them," Julian said, and smiled in a way that made her realize how long it had been since she smiled back. They talked until the hotel manager interrupted. As Julian packed his materials, he paused. "Would you want to grab coffee sometime? Discuss the acoustics more thoroughly?" Isabella should have said no, should have protected the fragile structure of her marriage. Instead, she wrote down her number with a hand that trembled slightly, already knowing she'd crossed a threshold she couldn't uncross. Coffee became a regular occurrence. Then dinners. Then walks through parts of the city Isabella had stopped noticing during her years of careful routine. Julian spoke about composition and color, about the way music could make you understand emotions you didn't have words for. He asked her questions, not the surface-level inquiries Marcus offered, but genuine curiosity about what she thought, what she felt, what she'd wanted before life became about logistics and compromises. "What were you before you became someone's wife?" he asked one evening, and Isabella realized she couldn't quite remember. They sat in a small restaurant with dim lights and the kind of intimacy that comes from being truly seen by another person. Julian's hand brushed hers across the table, and the sensation was so acute, so vivid, that Isabella felt tears gather unexpectedly. When was the last time she'd felt anything this intensely? "I was an artist," she heard herself say. "Before the marriage, the business, all of it. I painted. Not very well, but with passion." "Show me," Julian said simply. She took him to a gallery that showed her old work from a collective she'd abandoned in her 20s. The paintings were still there, bold, desperate, hungry pieces full of color and emotion. Looking at them beside Julian felt like meeting a younger version of herself and grieving what that version had surrendered. "This is who you are," Julian said, studying her face reflected in the glass. "You haven't disappeared. You're still here." Isabella felt something crack open inside her. For so long, she'd told herself that contentment was enough, that wanting more was ungrateful. But standing there, seeing her old work, hearing someone acknowledge the parts of herself she'd buried, it awakened a hunger she'd learned to ignore. When Julian kissed her that night, it felt like remembering something precious. Not the beginning of something new, but the resurrection of something that had always been alive inside her, just waiting for permission to breathe again. His mouth was warm against hers, and for the first time in years, she felt genuinely desired. The transgression. The hotel where it happened felt almost scripted, the same space she'd redesigned, now transformed by dim lighting and possibility. Isabella had told Marcus she was meeting a client about a new project. The lie came easier than it should have. In Julian's arms, she felt alive in a way that transcended the physical. Yes, there was desire, urgent and consuming after years of mechanical intimacy with Marcus, but it was more than that. It was being wanted for who she actually was, not just as a functional partner. Julian traced the contours of her body like he was reading poetry written across her skin. He whispered that she was beautiful, that she deserved to feel this way, that he couldn't imagine going back to living without her. Her breath caught as he kissed along her shoulder, his hands moving with intention and genuine appreciation. Every touch felt like he was collecting her, memorizing her, truly seeing her. She'd forgotten what it meant to be looked at with such hunger, such recognition of her worth. When she whispered his name, it came out like a prayer. They moved together slowly, deliberately, savoring each sensation. Isabella felt the weight of him against her, the warmth of his skin, the genuine tenderness mixed with passion. For the first time in 2 decades, her body didn't feel like a familiar routine. It felt like it belonged to someone who actually wanted it, craved it, valued it. For a brief moment in time, wrapped in white sheets as afternoon light filtered through the windows, Isabella existed entirely in the present moment. No regrets about the past, no anxiety about consequences. Just sensation and connection and the intoxicating feeling of being truly chosen. Afterward, Julian spoke about futures. He had a small property upstate, land where he'd always wanted to build a studio. He talked about waking up next to her, about traveling, about creating art together without the weight of obligation. He held her close as he painted these pictures with words, and Isabella felt herself falling deeper into the dream of it all. "Come with me," he said, and Isabella heard herself say yes without hesitation. But even as the word left her mouth, something flickered. A hesitation so brief she almost missed it. And yet, Isabella pushed the doubt away. She'd spent 20 years playing it safe. Safety had left her feeling like a ghost. The hotel receipt fell out of Isabella's jacket pocket on a Thursday night. Marcus found it while taking clothes to the laundry. She watched his face as he read it, the name of the hotel where she'd redesigned the lobby, the date, the room number. His expression shifted not to anger, but to something far worse, recognition. He'd known, she realized. On some level, he'd always known. "Who is he?" Marcus asked quietly. There seemed no point in lying. Isabella told him everything, Julian's name, how they met, the conversations that gradually became more, the affair that had awakened something inside her she thought was dead. She told him that Julian spoke about leaving, about building a life together, about all the things their marriage had stopped offering years ago. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set the receipt down carefully on the counter. "And does he know you're here? Telling me this?" We haven't discussed the timeline," Isabella admitted, and the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Timeline," Marcus repeated. Something in his voice broke. "Isabella, were we really that easy to replace? 20 years wasn't enough to make you stay? Wasn't enough to make me worth the fight?" She'd expected him to rage, to demand explanations, to threaten her with consequences. Instead, his quiet devastation was immeasurable. He looked at her like she was a stranger wearing her face, and in that moment, Isabella understood what she'd actually done. She hadn't just betrayed a marriage, she'd destroyed the only person who'd built his entire world around her. Marcus filed for divorce quietly and completely. No contested proceedings, no demands. He simply wanted to move forward. And Julian, faced with the reality that Isabella was actually available, that this would actually require sacrifice on his part, began to distance himself. His texts became shorter. His availability declined. When Isabella finally suggested they officially move in together, he spoke about needing time to process, about things moving too fast, about maybe they should have stayed as they were, something beautiful and undefined rather than demanding and permanent. Isabella realized she'd traded something real for something that had only ever been a mirror reflecting back her own hunger. The aftermath and revelation. The apartment was smaller than she'd imagined, and colder. Isabella sat on the edge of a bed that wasn't quite familiar, in a space that bore no mark of her presence. Julian had moved to Los Angeles for a residency, and his last message had been kind but conclusive. They'd had something beautiful, but it was defined by its impossibility. Now that it was possible, it couldn't exist anymore. She'd filed the divorce papers herself. Marcus had been so gracious about it that it somehow made it worse. The box arrived 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. No note, no explanation. Just Marcus's neat handwriting on the label, "Things you should have." Inside was a folder marked 20-year vision in his careful script. Isabella's hands shook as she opened it. Inside were sketches of their home redesigned, not by her, but by Marcus, attempting to imagine what she'd really wanted all along. There were notes about places she'd mentioned wanting to travel, researched extensively, itineraries planned with a kind of meticulous care that only came from someone who paid attention to every word you ever spoke. There were printed emails from artists he'd been collecting, contemporary painters whose work matched her old style, a commission he'd been quietly arranging for her to create a new collection. There were journal entries, dozens of them, where Marcus had written about his fears that he wasn't enough, that he'd failed to keep her wanting him, that he'd been so focused on building a stable life that he'd forgotten to build an alive one. And then the final sketch, a plan for a vow renewal. A private ceremony at the gallery where her old paintings hung. He'd planned to ask her to paint again, to reclaim that part of herself together. The date had been their anniversary, 2 weeks before she'd given him the receipt. Isabella sank to the floor, holding these pieces of a man who loved her more completely than she'd ever allowed herself to recognize. A love that didn't demand fireworks but instead showed up in meticulous attention, quiet devotion, and the kind of sacrifice that meant planning your wife's happiness even as she drifted away from you. She thought about Marcus's hands preparing sketches for a future they'd never have. She remembered the way he'd always made her tea exactly as she liked it, the small notes he'd left in her lunch on days he knew would be difficult, the quiet way he'd held her through her mother's illness without ever asking for recognition or gratitude. His love had been patient and persistent, written into 20 years of small, perfect moments she'd been too blind to see. That night, Isabella did something she hadn't done in 20 years. She set up a canvas in her new apartment. Not because Julian had asked her to, not because she was running from anything anymore, but because she finally understood that the art had never left her, it had just been waiting for her to come home to herself. And as she painted, tears streaming down her face, she painted Marcus. Not as he was in the quiet resignation of her betrayal, but as he'd always been trying to be for her, patient, devoted, endlessly creative in his love, building a life of thoughtful beauty around her every need. She painted the future they could have built together if she'd only looked hard enough to see that what she was searching for had been there all along, carved into every day, every moment, every quiet gesture of his unwavering heart. The cruelest and most beautiful realization was that Marcus had been trying to give her exactly what she'd gone searching for in Julian's arms. He'd just been taking his time about it, building towards something meant to last forever. In the end, Isabella understood that true desire wasn't found in the intensity of forbidden moments. It lived in the patient devotion of someone who remembered every word you spoke, who saw you even when you'd stopped seeing yourself, who kept loving you even as you broke his heart. She'd finally come home.